and a very warm welcome to all of you. And we really hope all of you are safe wherever you are. And you're watching us today here at ORF. We continue to bring all the global narratives shaping around coronavirus or COVID-19. And today, some of the big questions that we are going to look at is, first of all, the US-China relationship vis-a-vis America suspending the funding to WHO for the meantime. Along with this, we will also look at how China is using the pandemic to its gain. And the Chinese army is gaining by it. Professor Harsh Pant, who is joining us today here, has done a paper on it, and we will ask him why does he think so, and how's China flexing its muscle. We will also look at Europe's reaction, especially France and UK, to China, and India's role in the region. So these are some of the big questions that we're going to look at. Professor Pant, we want to begin why the big shakeup that happened, and America or Donald Trump finally decided to withdraw the money that America has been giving to World Health Organization, because Donald Trump has been claiming that the entire approach of WHO has been very China-centric, the way it has handled COVID-19. Now, we all know that WHO has been accused of, first of all, some missteps, misinformation, covering up. But at the same time, there is also this view that this is not the time to stop funding the WHO. This is the time when all of us or the entire world needs to come together collectively. US stopping the funding, how do you think is it going to affect WHO's work? And this should also be looked at in the context of the US-China relationship, which was already, not going great, and there was a trade war already going on before COVID-19 pandemic.
I think Mr. Trump, thank you, Nagma. Mr. Trump has taken this extraordinary measure, I think, more in alignment with the requirements of his domestic political base, which now finds, which now views China as another Mexico. You might recall that during his last campaign in 2016, there was a lot of talk about Mexico, how immigration from Mexico is a problem. And I think Mr. Trump has successfully now made China the next fulcrum of his political campaigning. And in some ways, whatever he's doing, targeting China, in some ways, China needs to be targeted. China needs to be held accountable for what has been going on in the world. But I think if you see how Mr. Trump has approached this issue, it is largely through the prism of his domestic politics. And I think that is why his, the cutting of funding for the WTO till such time as he says investigations are carried out about how WHO has performed. We all know that WHO has been complicit in some ways in the way China has tried to shape the narrative post the outbreak of coronavirus. And the leadership at WHO has not been effective enough in countering some of the challenges that have emanated from China and in leading the world response collectively. So clearly there have been misgivings. These misgivings are not Mr. Trump's misgivings only, they are misgivings around the world. But what Mr. Trump has done is drastically changed the rules of the game, if you will, because now what happens is that he has given the space to China now to enter the fray and again make a case that, look, China is a responsible global player. America has almost become roguish. Here is a time when the world should have been coming together to fight the pandemic. It was a time to strengthen WHO. And here Mr. Trump has taken away the funding, which is critically needed for some of the most vulnerable, some of the poorest countries in the world that have very basic health infrastructure. So clearly, I think in the battle of narratives, China might emerge as a country that perhaps gains from this, while Mr. Trump might gain in the short term politically. But in the long term, whether it does anything to enhance America's credibility as a global leader, I am very doubtful about that. There are questions certainly around what kind. I think the reality is that America is the single largest donor to WHO, around more than 800 million, whereas China has been increasing its contribution, but it still is around 80 million. So clearly there is no comparison here. But what I think is happening now is that the perception would gain ground, that it is all about Mr. Trump, that it is all about his politics, it is all about America first, and that he does not have the best interests of the world in his mind, whereas China would be laying claim to a larger global, sort of a leadership role, which perhaps might benefit China as a global leader.
A question related to this. Do you think then China gains in the race of global leadership, whereas America loses out, even though America gains from it domestically? Mr. Trump gains in his domestic politics.
Absolutely. I think he gains. I think that's where perhaps his whole focus and energies are engaged. If you look at his response from the very beginning, it has been about how fast can I open up the American economy, because the worse the American economy does, his chances of retaining the presidency recede. And I think that is how he has shaped his policy response to this crisis. So clearly, his interests lie elsewhere. And at this point, he is doubling down on China and making it clear to the world and to his domestic political base in particular that it is China that is responsible for this crisis. China needs to be held accountable for, but in doing so, he seems to be, as they say, cutting off your nose to spite the face. That you are doing something that America, at this point in particular, if it was serious about global leadership, it should not be doing that.
So America shouldn't not be doing this if it was serious about global relationship. That space America has, in a way, vacated. But China, in your paper, like you mentioned, that China could be eyeing military gains from the pandemic, while the rest of the world we've seen is still grappling with COVID-19 and is busy managing life and death. You're saying this because we've seen an increased aggression by China in the South China Sea. We've seen the sinking of Vietnamese trawler, military exercise in South China Sea. So in your paper, you mentioned that China is revving up its production of submarines to meet demands from Pakistan, from Thailand. And in a way, this pandemic has created benefits for the Communist Party. On what basis are you saying? What activities are you seeing? And how is the Communist Party gaining?
Well, it is extremely ironical that here is a Communist Party leadership which is so complicit in the mismanagement of this crisis from the very beginning. But it is seemingly at this point at least doing better in terms of convincing Chinese audiences, Chinese people, that they have a handle on this situation. Now, clearly, because they control the flow of information, they can manage that information flow in ways that suits their needs. And in the short term in particular, when you have authoritarian countries, they tend to benefit when there is a crisis, because there is also a sense of rallying around the flag. China has made this almost a nationalistic issue, that this is an issue about Chinese ability to manage a crisis, Chinese ability to project itself. And in the process, it has gone out, for example, using whatever space it finds available. For example, in Europe, it has found that there are tensions between northern European countries, southern European countries. It has tried to drive a wedge there. Similarly, I think on the military issues in particular, it's very interesting, because we are not really interested at this point on what is happening in the military realm. But clearly, if you look carefully, you find a pattern emerging where, irrespective of what is happening on the life and death issues here in other countries, how people are engaged with some of the very, very serious questions about their very existence, nations are struggling to cope with this virus. China has carefully been using the space for strategic gains, away from the spotlight of the world media, which is completely focused on things which are more relevant, rightfully so, in their view, on life and death of ordinary people, and how they are coping with it, how nations are struggling with it. But China has gone ahead, conducting military exercises, having spats with its neighbors in South China Sea, be it Indonesia as well as Vietnam, and I think there is also a sense in which this, as it revives its military-industrial complex, in particular in Wuhan, which is a center of a lot of its military industrial production. There, the idea is that China not only is reviving in industrial production, China is also reviving its defense exports, which is quite interesting. It might in the short term come out as we are being told that industrial activity is picking up in China, and it might be possible for China to lay claims to a larger share of the global market as other countries struggle to come to this new reality. So we are looking at a landscape from Chinese perspective, where Chinese government can also use military as an instrumentality of power projection. They are using medical diplomacy, for example, in some cases. They have used that very effectively. But in the case of military also, there are signs that they are coming out, that they are doing things which perhaps might lay the foundations of a larger Chinese military presence in and around the world, in and around China's periphery. So clearly, I think for China, this is a moment, this is an opportunity which it can use. This is a vacuum that it can fill. And as other countries grapple, as other major powers in particular grapple with their own problems, here is an opportunity for the Chinese Communist Party to project itself as a party that is nationalist to the core, that is looking after Chinese national interests, even at the time of global pandemic, and projecting Chinese influence abroad at a time when other countries might not be interested in such matters. So great power politics, Chinese military projection continues.
Yeah, so it's very interesting that while the rest of the world is dealing with life and death, is busy handling COVID-19 pandemic, China is using this crisis in the best possible way and to its advantage. And not only that, like you said, it's gone ahead and conducted military exercises. It's engaging in spats with its neighbors. There's also this story, interestingly, that probably it has gone ahead and tested a nuclear device.
Yes, I think there are a lot of loose ends in that story, and we will need to see what happens. But I think it's a remarkable story to come out for a number of reasons. One is that at this point in time, for the story to emerge, I think again testifies to certain adaptiveness in Chinese behavior, even if it is not true. There have been reports for a very long time that in the Lopnor site in China, certain things are going on, and the Chinese are preparing that site for reasons they know best. But I think for the US department to come out with this report at this particular point in time, of course, US has its own interests here. There have been a lot of discussion around bringing China into the arms control framework, and therefore projecting China as a country that is also conducting nuclear tests, although they are below yield nuclear tests, allegedly below yield tests, which China has conducted according to this report. But I think the larger point here is that one is looking at China, which in the opinion of many analysts is capable of doing this even at this point. And I think that tells you something about the widening disparity between how certain sections of the world community view China's rise today. That here is a pandemic, here is a crisis of global proportions, something we have not seen anything like this as UN says since the two world wars, and yet China continues apace with certain kinds of activity in the eyes of certain analysts, which perhaps other countries might find quite ludicrous or quite out of the ordinary. But here is China that continues to go on a global march. Here is a China that continues to develop its military. Here is a China that allegedly has even gone ahead and conducted a nuclear test. So I think there are questions around this story. There are all sorts of questions that will be raised and discussed in the coming days and months. But I think the potential that this could have happened itself tells you something about the rise of China and the threat that many in the West are feeling from this.
Yeah, while America is still struggling to reopen America, here in India, of course, we are looking at giving concessions and how to exit from the lockdown. But when we look at the Chinese medical diplomacy or the Chinese reactions or the way China has handled this pandemic, there has been, in a way, a strong response also from European nations. We can say that there is actually a clash between the global leaders and China and the Chinese leadership. UK very clearly has said that once this is over, it cannot be business as usual with China. We've seen France also coming out strongly, and Macron saying that it's very naive to assume that China has handled COVID-19 in a better way than the rest of us. So we see a very strong European reaction. The relationship between Europe and China will also probably not be the same. And even now we are seeing a reaction there.
Absolutely. I think, a lot of these things that we are discussing today, and we look at China's role and China's certain activities, and we we might conclude that perhaps China comes out as a country that is looking more formidable. But I think therein also lies China's weaknesses. And I think what this pandemic has done, in some ways, fundamentally revealed China's approach and the way China manages its diplomacy and its own domestic political system. It has exposed those vulnerabilities to the world. So while at one point in time Europeans were in awe of China, today, when you have countries like France and the UK and Germany looking at China and questioning the way China has handled the initial stages of this pandemic, I think it's a battle of narratives. It's largely a questioning of Chinese motives and intent, and ultimately it is a broader question whether China can be relied upon to be a responsible global stakeholder. So the kinds of comments that we have heard from Emmanuel Macron, Dominic Raab from the UK, from the Germans, from the European Union, and from Mr. Trump himself for different sets of reasons. But I think all of that tell you a story about the greater sense of apprehensions that are now dominating about China's rise. So in the long term, I'm not so sure that this aggressive Chinese diplomacy post-COVID-19 will help China in projecting itself as a great power. It might impede now Chinese abilities, because in some ways countries have recognized that China, what kind of a power China can potentially be. And therefore, for those countries, it's very important to push back.
So you say that countries can become very wary of China and the way China is approaching diplomacy, very assertive diplomacy we can see. When we look at India and its role in this region, particularly I would like to, mention two papers that have come out at ORF. The first one is by Sony Bose, and it is on Afghanistan. And we want to look at India's role in Afghanistan, especially in the health sector, because we know India has done a lot in the health sector in Afghanistan. But since the US and Taliban peace talks, when we are still not sure what will be the outcome because the intra-Afghan talks have been delayed, we do not know what is the possible scenario there. What do you see? What are the possibilities in which India can contribute, or what role can India play in the health sector in Afghanistan, which is badly ravaged by war, by the Taliban rule? And over the years, India has tried to build the health system there. But right now, what will be the possibility in the emerging political scenario?
See, I think Nagma, what we are looking at is an Indian style of diplomacy that we have seen being conducted over the last few weeks and months under this crisis. And I think Afghanistan also is part of around 55 odd countries to which India is sending medicines, medical supplies like HUQ and paracetamol, for example. And India has been, trying to help countries to the best of its ability, under the radar, more modest, more subtle. But I think it also projects India in a slightly different light compared to China. And therefore, it is important for India to be that kind of a leader, to project itself in ways that matter. And in particular, in its neighborhood. If you recall, Prime Minister Modi's call for the SAR conference, video conference on COVID-19 as a regional response to this crisis was the first of its kind. So clearly, I think, and what we have seen since then is that India, despite its internal problems, have been regularly engaged at the prime ministerial, at the ministerial level with its global interlocutors. Now, it is not the same kind of a diplomacy that China is conducting, very aggressive, very potent, very in your face, very with the media, but it is more subtle, more about the needs of the countries that India wants to help based on their requirements. And I think that is something that India has also been doing with its neighbors. So some aspects, for example, that you touch upon in the paper, that this paper looks at the Afghan sector, health sector, where India has done much to improve Afghan health sector, and we look forward to improving the efficiency of that sector as not in the immediate, not in the immediacy because of this crisis, but over the long term, if things if things normalize there, but also in countries like Bhutan and Bangladesh and Nepal, where India has had long-standing ties to the health sectors there. So clearly, as a region, India has done traditionally a lot, but clearly this space that this crisis provides India allows India to look at its role as as a supplier of medical capacities, medical capabilities, not simply in the neighborhood but also beyond. And I hope that trend continues even after things have stabilized, immediate crisis has abated. India should continue with its diplomatic outreach, because that's the only way India can leverage its strengths that it has in critical sectors and can engage with the rest of the world on terms that are more equitable and development oriented.
Yeah. Harsh, very briefly, we would like to touch upon India-Pakistan also, because we see the cross-border tension, um, in spite of Corona, is quite high. We've seen violations, in fact, ceasefire violations in March itself of 411, which is highest in a month since 2018. We've seen India slamming Pakistan because of its delayed response to the SARC fund for COVID-19. So while all of this is happening, we also just got the news that America has provided aid to Pakistan to fight coronavirus, which is about $8.4 million. So looking at all this, and the tension continues between India and Pakistan during these times.
Well, I think that is a story that is, that continues. Even there doesn't seem much difference in the pre-COVID-19 and post-COVID-19 phase. India had made an outreach in the initial phases. You had Pakistan participation in the COVID-19 conference that India had convened, SARC conference that India had convened. But after that, we have not seen much initiative from Pakistan, and we have also seen a certain sense of complacency within Pakistani establishment itself related to how to handle this pandemic. And I think that in particular, I think more than anything else, that bodes well for the region, bodes ill for the region, because if this region being what it is with porous borders, if any one country is not serious about fighting the pandemic within its own borders and effectively fighting it, then I think it creates problems for all the countries. And I think by and large, you had the military-industrial complex, military intelligence complex in Pakistan that continues to view even this pandemic through a geopolitical lens, which is quite unfortunate and may not bode well either for the for the health of the ordinary Pakistanis or for the region or for regional stability. We can forget India-Pakistan relationship, because that continues to be where it was even before the crisis. So I think we are looking at continuing turbulence on that front, unfortunately. But hopefully, if other countries in the region can come together and can make a common cause, then perhaps that will bring Pakistan also into the fold in the short to medium term.
And that's probably the need of the hour, to come together for a common cause. And the turbulence in this sector, at least we hope that it might be contained, or it should be contained. Thank you so much, Harsh, for that discussion, and thank you all of you for joining us on Ideas Factory.